We learn the scale of love not by the noise it makes, but by the silence it endures. There is a certain hush that comes to a house when the last workday ends and no one needs you anymore. It's not the quiet of peace exactly. It's the quiet of after. After the children go. After the paychecks stop. After your name is no longer spoken in the halls of a hospital where you spent 30 years listening for it. Evelyn Moore learned the sound of that hush one Tuesday in late October, when the light slipped through the maple leaves like loose coins and the neighborhood dogs barked at nothing in particular. Her house sat on a corner lot, stooped like an old man with his hands in his coat pockets. The paint had been the color of butter once. Now it was something between memory and beige. The steps creaked like knees. Evelyn liked to think the house was only mirroring her, stubborn, standing, a bit chipped but loyal. She had retired in June, turned in her hospital badge and her sensible shoes, and told the nurses on the ward to text if they needed her to fill in. They did not text. The young rarely imagined the old as a plan B. Mornings were her strong suit. She would wake before the sun because habits grip you tighter than lovers do. She put the kettle on measured coffee, one level scoop too generous, and watched the steam rise, the way a prayer rises even when you forget the words. She ate toast with jam at the small kitchen table. In front of her, the old landline phone, a bruised plum color, sat like a promise no one intended to keep. She told herself not to watch the phone, that there was reading to do, a stack of library novels with glossy covers that smelled faintly of rain and other people's houses. There was a garden out back that needed attention. The tomatoes, left to a wildness, had become small red lanterns among a tangle of vines. She clipped them carefully, wiped the dirt on her jeans, and brought them inside in a blue plastic colander that had survived more summers than some marriages do. A new message would make the machine click. But it didn't click. That meant Lucas was busy again. He was always busy, with code to write and meetings to lead and some fitness app that reminded him to stand, breathe, drink water, succeed. He lived 2 flights and a continent away in San Francisco, where people called coffee, third wave, and time a currency. He would have visited if Q4 wasn't insane, Mom. He said Q4 like someone says winter, as if it was a force of nature. Anna might have called. She used to call late the way artists call, when the world is soft and the voice can be honest without sounding like a confession. But lately her number showed up less. The last time she had sounded brittle, as though every word cost her something. It's just a lot right now, she had told Evelyn, which was the sentence people used when the truth was unsayable. Evelyn never charged the girl for her silence. She only listened until the call ended, then stood very still in the kitchen as if she could hold the connection by not moving. The quiet lays different in each room. In the living room, it's respectable, like a librarian. In the hallway, it's a draft. In the bedroom, it's a hand on your shoulder, reminding you gently that no one else will tuck you in. Evelyn moved through the house the way a lighthouse beam sweeps its water, slow, consistent, believing someone out there might need the light. On the mantel were school pictures. Lucas in a Star Wars t-shirt with a grin that showed his back teeth. Anna with paint on her fingers even then, hair in flyaway rebellion against the comb. In between the frames stood a vase Daniel had given her last Christmas, sea green glass, odd and beautiful. Daniel lived next door, a widower with the courtly manners of a bygone time. He kept his lawn trimmed and his grief private. When he saw Evelyn at the mailbox, he touched the brim of a hat he didn't wear, out of habit more than need. "You're well?" he would ask. "I'm well," she'd answer, which was often only half true. She had not planned on retirement, not really. She had planned on a different kind of later, the kind that arrives with grandchildren and school plays and inexplicable clay sculptures wrapped in tissue paper at Thanksgiving. She had imagined teaching small hands to sift flour, to cut butter into tiny squares, to think of pie as a math problem and a love letter. But later comes as it wants. For some, later is a parade. For others, it sits beside you on the couch and says nothing. If she were honest, the house suited her. Order reassured Evelyn, and she ran the place like a quiet ward. Mondays were for laundry, and she folded towels with a nurse's precision, edges aligned, promises contained. Tuesdays she dusted shelves that barely needed it, and memory floated up in the moats like pollen. Wednesdays, she stripped the beds and washed the sheets so that sleep might feel like a fresh start. Thursdays, she shopped. Fridays, she made soup that tasted better on Saturday. And on Sunday, she dressed in navy and went to the white church with the cracked bell where the pastor preached about the prodigal son, and she thought always about the mother, whom scripture never mentions. In the afternoon, she went out to the porch with her coffee and the knitting she'd taken up only to keep her hands from reading her loneliness like braille. Children on bicycles zigzagged down the sidewalk. Delivery trucks exhaled at the curb. A squirrel, audacious, ran the fence rail like a gymnast, glanced back at Evelyn as if to say, "You again?" The sun slid along the street and caught the wind chime Daniel had fixed for her last spring. It wasn't really a chime, more a handful of old flatware he'd strung with fishing line so it sang like a kitchen drawer in a good mood. The mail came at 2. It brought coupons, circulars, a glossy flyer for a gym promising to turn your body into a promise. There was no letter from Lucas. He could have written if he wanted. He used to write from college, printing neatly, telling her about professors who said curious things and frisbee on the quad, and a girl with freckles who played the cello and broke his heart in April. Maybe letters ended when we learned how to abbreviate feeling with a thumbs up. On the kitchen counter, a notebook lay open. Lists made you feel like a person moving forward. She wrote, "Pick up milk, repair porch step, call insurance." Under that, without a box to check, she wrote, "Remember, you did your best." She didn't always believe it. Belief she had found needs constant feeding, like stray cats. Toward evening, the light in the house softened. This is when a memory can look like a doorway. Evelyn wiped the counters again, already clean, and turned on the radio to fill the rooms with people who would talk without needing anything from her. The host's voice was smooth, the way good stones are smooth from water. There was a story about a couple in their 90s who still held hands at the grocery store, about a kindergarten teacher who taught his class how to plant daffodils in paper cups, about a fire department rescuing a duck from a storm drain. The world had its sweetness. You just had to tune to it. At 5:30, her chest tightened with a feeling she'd never quite named. The hour when a mother expects to be needed. She set the pot on the stove and browned onions, not because she was hungry, but because the smell of onions softening in butter makes a room feel occupied. She added carrots, celery, the last of the tomatoes, a handful of rice. The soup murmured. Steam fogged the window and turned the maples outside into watercolors. The phone sat, unlit, unringing. Evelyn checked the screen as if she might have missed something. She hadn't. She lifted it anyway, the way you lift a seashell to your ear, half hoping for an ocean. She scrolled to Lucas's name and read the last message. "Can't talk. Launch week. You good?" She had answered, "I'm fine, proud of you." She scrolled to Anna's thread. It ended 3 weeks ago with "Don't worry about me." She had replied, "I always will." The dots never appeared. She put the phone back where it lived and took out the good plates. It is a curious habit of the lonely to use the good things when no one is looking, as if to say to the universe, "See, I know what I'm worth." She laid a clean cloth on the dining table, white with a faint, embroidered border her mother had stitched when eyes were cheap and time was dear. She placed a plate at the head and 2 more on either side. She set forks, knives, spoons. She poured water into 3 glasses and watched the bubbles stick to the sides like tiny passengers waiting for their stop. In the middle of the table, she placed the sea green vase. She added 3 marigolds from the yard and a sprig of rosemary. Remembrance, the herb says. The room smelled warm and sharp, a small kitchen symphony. She ladled soup into a serving bowl and set it down on a trivet Lucas had made in 7th grade woodshop, crooked and perfect. She folded cloth napkins into triangles, the way she had shown Anna when the girl was 8, and took direction like a kite in heavy wind. Outside, the streetlights blinked awake. A car door thudded somewhere far off. A television in a neighboring house laughed canned laughter. The wind chime gave a little clatter, then settled. Evelyn stood at the doorway and looked at the table the way one looks at a photograph, trying to step into it. 3 places, enough for a family. The house seemed to sit up straighter in the presence of this arrangement. For a moment she imagined the front door opening, the cold sliding in with the bodies she had made. Lucas dropping his bag. Distracted and apologetic, kissing her on the temple without quite slowing down. Anna shrugging her coat off with a guilty smile, smelling of oil paint and city air. We made it, one of them would say. Finally, the other might add. She heard none of that, only the clock in the hall practicing its heartbeat. On the counter, the landline's red eye remained a dull, unwavering dot. No messages. The phone was as honest as gravity. Evelyn moved to the head of the table. She pulled out the chair the way a hostess might, with ceremony, because the way you treat a moment teaches the moment how to behave. She sat. The cushion exhaled. She placed her hands palm down on the linen and felt the weave, firm and forgiving, beneath her fingers. "Bless this meal," she whispered out of muscle memory. She did not say bless us, perhaps she couldn't. She lifted the ladle and filled her bowl. Steam rose and fogged her glasses, and she took them off to wipe with the hem of her sleeve. The house listened. She tasted the soup. It was good. It was always good when she cooked it for other people. She smiled at that, how love improves a recipe even in its absence. The second hand continued its small, faithful work. Somewhere, a siren wailed. Somewhere else, laughter rushed up a staircase. In here, the light held steady. And in the quiet dining room of the butter-colored house, with 3 places set and only one occupied, Evelyn Moore ate her dinner alone. There is a certain ache that doesn't belong to the body. It sits somewhere between your ribs and your memories, where voices live long after the people who spoke them have gone quiet. Evelyn felt that ache on a Wednesday morning while folding a towel still warm from the dryer. It was the same towel she used when Lucas was a boy, and she would wrap him after baths, his small shoulders slick with soap and laughter. Now it smelled of detergent and absence. The house was still, but her mind was not. The quiet had started speaking again, softly, insistently, pulling her back into years she thought she had neatly boxed away. She didn't fight it. Memory, like the tide, always comes back to claim what belongs to it. It began in a hospital room 2 decades earlier when life first split in two, before and after. Her husband, Richard, had been a firefighter, a man of calloused hands and easy smiles. He had died the way such men often do, in service, sudden and selfless. The night the siren stopped outside her door, Evelyn had opened it and known, without words, that her children's childhood had ended. Lucas was 12, Anna barely 7. The officer's voice had been soft, his hat pressed against his chest like an apology. After the funeral, Evelyn went back to work the next week. There wasn't time to fall apart. Grief had to wait its turn between double shifts and overdue bills. She learned to live on instant coffee and adrenaline. Her hands, once gentle, became maps of small injuries. Paper cuts from medical charts, burns from hurried meals, cracks from winter and bleach. But her voice never broke in front of the children. It was always steady. "We'll be all right," she told them, as if saying it could bend the truth into shape. She took every extra shift she could. She patched hand-me-downs, learned to fix leaky faucets, changed tires on a borrowed car. Lucas grew faster than she could afford him. He learned early that the world respected speed, not softness. Anna clung to her sketchbook, drawing things they couldn't buy: birthday cakes, new sneakers, sunlight through bigger windows. Evelyn sometimes wondered if she was raising them or simply keeping them from falling apart. Now, years later, she stood in her kitchen and opened the drawer where she kept old letters and photographs. Her private archive of what love looked like before phones made us lazy with words. There were crayon drawings folded like sacred scripts, stick figures under a crooked rainbow labeled Mom plus me plus Luke plus Dad. There were report cards, postcards from class trips, and a stack of cards that said World's Best Mom, written in different handwritings, each smaller than the last. And then there was the envelope. The return address was faded, the postmark smudged, but she knew it. Lucas had written it his first semester of college, years ago. She unfolded it with the care of someone handling evidence. "Mom, you don't have to worry so much," it read in his precise block letters. "I'm figuring things out. Don't work too hard. You deserve to rest sometime." There was no signature. He had probably rushed to class, meaning to write again soon. He never did. She smiled faintly. Rest sometime? That phrase had aged strangely. Rest had come, but not in the way he meant. Beside that letter lay another, Anna's handwriting this time, rounder, looped with emotion. "Sorry for yelling last night. I didn't mean it. I just hate how small this town feels. I want to see everything, even if it means leaving you. Evelyn had read that one the night Anna boarded the bus for art school. She'd watched from the curb as her daughter pressed her face against the window, waving until the road curved out of sight. The house had been too quiet that night, too. A car door slammed outside. Evelyn startled, half expecting a miracle, but it was only Daniel unloading groceries from his trunk. He looked up and waved, a simple kindness that still startled her. She waved back. He crossed the lawn with the slow assurance of a man who never hurried conversation. Got too many apples again, he said, offering a brown paper bag. She smiled. You do that every week. I'm consistent, he said, and his grin made the years between them seem less heavy. They talked on the porch, about the weather, the price of gas, the neighbor's new dog. And somehow, as talk does when the sun lowers and guardrails weaken, it wandered into memory. Daniel spoke about his wife, how she used to hum while baking. Evelyn listened, nodding, until he asked, You miss him, your husband? Every day, she said, but not in the way I used to. Grief changes shape. It hides in different corners. Sometimes it looks like a clock that never ticks loud enough. Daniel nodded. Sometimes it sounds like the radio left on in an empty room. They sat for a while without talking, the shared silence doing what words couldn't. When he left, he said, If you ever need company for dinner. He let the rest hang, respectful of her solitude. After he was gone, the porch felt larger, emptier, and something inside her stirred. Not loneliness exactly, but its gentler cousin, longing. That night, Evelyn opened an old shoebox from the closet. Inside were scraps of paper her children had once called Mother's Mailbox. It was a game they played when they were little. Each would leave her notes when they were mad or wanted something, but were too shy to ask. She unfolded one. Lucas, age 10, I'm sorry for yelling when you made broccoli. I know you try. Another from Anna, written in glitter pen. Please don't make Luke tell me I can't sing. I can sing. She laughed softly. The sound startled her. She read a final one she didn't remember. Mom, don't be sad when we're big. We'll come back. Her throat tightened. Children made promises with crayons they could never keep. She stayed there for a long time, surrounded by paper ghosts, until the smell of rain drifted through the open window. Thunder rolled far off like the sky clearing its throat. She gathered the letters, pressed them back into the box, and carried it to her bedside. On top of it, she laid her reading glasses, a habit she had, as if to remind herself that memory still needed seeing. The next morning, the phone finally rang. Evelyn nearly dropped the coffee pot. She answered quickly, too quickly. Hello? Hey, Mom. Lucas's voice clipped businesslike. Luke, she said softly, already smiling. You sound tired. Yeah, long week. Listen, I might not make it home for Thanksgiving. There's a client thing. Oh, she tried to hide the pause. Of course, work comes first. He exhaled, the way people do when they've done something slightly shameful. I'll try for Christmas, okay? She wanted to say okay is fine. I miss you, but the words tangled behind her teeth. Instead, she said, I'll keep the light on. Thanks, Mom. Love you. The call ended before she could answer. The house returned to its quiet, but the sound of his voice lingered like perfume in an empty hallway. She poured herself a cup of coffee, carried it to the window, and whispered, I love you too. The words fogged the glass, then disappeared. The way breath always does. Outside, the maple leaves fell one by one, each landing softer than the last. And inside, in the butter-colored house that remembered more than it contained, Evelyn stood alone, surrounded by the voices of the past, each one still calling her name. There are calls that sound like nothing at first, just a ring, a voice, a few words exchanged. But later you remember every second of them, how the silence in between sentences felt heavier than the words themselves. Evelyn didn't know that this would be one of those calls. It was a gray morning, the kind that smelled of rain before it fell. The light was dull, the kind that makes even coffee taste tired. Evelyn had been sitting at the table, reading through a letter she'd found from Richard, one written before he died. The paper had yellowed around the edges, and the ink had bled slightly, but his handwriting was still steady. If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll keep the kids close. No matter what, that's how you'll stay whole. She had folded that letter countless times over the years, smoothing the creases like a prayer. But lately, that promise had felt harder to keep. Keep them close. She whispered it under her breath. How, Richard? They're already gone. The phone rang. It startled her. For a second, her heart lifted, that foolish flutter of hope that still lived in her chest like a stubborn child. She wiped her hands on her apron and answered. Hi, Mom. Lucas's voice, familiar, hurried, efficient, the voice of a man who measured time and profit margins. Luke, she said, smiling despite herself. You called? Yeah, I had a few minutes before a meeting. He cleared his throat like he was bracing himself. I wanted to talk about the house. Evelyn froze. The house? Yeah, I've been thinking it's too big for you now, Mom, and old. You shouldn't have to keep it up by yourself. You could sell it, get a nice condo downtown near the hospital, maybe. It would make things easier. Easier, the word landed like a small betrayal. I don't need easier, Lucas, she said gently. This is my home. I know, he replied, his voice softening then tightening again. But it's not practical. The roof leaks, the plumbing's ancient. You shouldn't be living alone out there. I could help you list it. I even know a realtor. Lucas, her tone stopped him. She rarely interrupted her son. Your father built this house, every nail, every beam. She stopped herself before her voice cracked. This isn't just wood and walls. I get that, but no. She said quietly. You don't. There was a pause, a long one, he sighed. Mom, I'm just trying to make sure you're okay. I know you are, she said. But sometimes being okay isn't about moving on. Sometimes it's about staying where love still lives. Lucas didn't answer right away. He sounded tired. You always make it sound so emotional. It's not emotion, Luke, she said. It's memory, and memory is what keeps a heart from getting lost. He chuckled softly, the way people do when they don't want to argue but don't agree either. All right, Mom, we'll talk about it later, okay? Of course. She said, we'll talk later. Love you. She hesitated. I love you too. The line went dead. Evelyn sat there for a long time, the phone still in her hand. The sound of his voice echoed like footsteps in an empty hall. She stared at the wall across from her, the one with the pencil marks from when Lucas and Anna were children, where she'd tracked their heights every birthday. The tallest line was Lucas's, with a crooked L scrawled beside it in his 14-year-old handwriting. The next was Anna's, curving and messy, marked with a heart. Sell it? The thought made her chest ache. To him, it was just a house. To her, it was the last piece of a life that had once been whole. She stood up, restless, her knees protesting as she moved. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, as though the conversation had thickened it somehow. She walked to the sink and stared out the window. Across the lawn, Daniel was trimming his hedges, humming faintly to a tune she couldn't place. When he saw her, he lifted a hand in greeting. She waved back, forcing a smile. A moment later, she saw him glance toward the peeling paint on her porch railing. He hesitated, then called out, Need a hand with that, Miss Moore? Not today, Daniel, she said, but thank you. He nodded, studying her a moment longer. You sure? Yes, she lied. After he went back to his hedges, she leaned against the sink, watching the first drops of rain hit the glass. The sound was soft, like someone tapping gently to be let in. That evening, she found herself opening the drawer again, the one with the letters. She took out a small notebook she hadn't touched in years. Inside were handwritten recipes, budget notes, and prayers disguised as lists. On the first page, written in her younger hand, For the kids, things to remember when I'm gone. She read the first line and felt something inside her tremble. Don't measure success by distance. You can fly far and still be lost. She shut the notebook quickly, as if afraid of her own truth. At dusk, Daniel knocked on her door, holding an umbrella and a small plate of apple pie. Made too much, he said, which she knew was a lie. They ate at the kitchen table, listening to the rain. Conversation was gentle, the way kindness speaks when it doesn't want to intrude. You ever think of leaving? He asked softly. Evelyn looked at him, surprised. Leaving where? The house, this place. She smiled faintly. Everyone seems to think I should. Not me, he said. I think some roots aren't meant to be moved. That made her smile for real. Thank you, Daniel. For what? For understanding. They didn't speak for a while after that. The only sound was the rain, soft and steady, like a voice repeating something you already knew but needed to hear again. When he left, Evelyn stood by the window watching him cross the lawn. The porch light threw long shadows behind him. For a brief moment, she imagined another shadow beside his, one taller, broader, familiar. She could almost see Richard walking with him, nodding approvingly. Keep the kids close, she murmured again, clutching the letter in her hand. But how do you keep what doesn't want to stay? She walked to the dining table, set for three as always. The plates still waited, polished and hopeful. She touched the edge of one gently, as though it might answer. Her reflection shimmered in the glass of the framed photo beside it, her younger self standing between two laughing children and a man whose arm rested across her shoulder. For a second, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of movement in that reflection, as if the past were trying to step forward. And that's when the phone rang again. It was Anna this time. Mom? Her daughter's voice was brittle, anxious. Can I come home for a few days? Evelyn's throat tightened. Of course, sweetheart, you never have to ask. She hung up and looked around the quiet house, the rain, the table, the waiting plates, and felt something shift. The silence was no longer empty, it was expectant. She whispered to herself, half in disbelief, they're coming home. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance. Inside, for the first time in months, the old house seemed to breathe again. There are moments in life that begin quietly, with the hum of a refrigerator, the scrape of a chair, the smell of something simmering, and yet they hold the weight of years. That morning, Evelyn woke before dawn, her heart oddly light. For the first time in months, she had a reason to cook more than one serving. Anna was coming home. She could almost see her daughter's face, that fragile mix of rebellion and tenderness that never quite left, even when time hardened it. Evelyn wanted the house to look the way Anna remembered, the smell of stew in the air, clean curtains, the faint crackle of an old song on the radio, so she cooked. By 7, the kitchen was alive again, onions hissing in butter, tomatoes softening into color, rosemary scenting the air. The rhythm of her hands, chopping, stirring, tasting, was the closest thing she knew to prayer. She dusted the old tablecloth, set out the plates. The same 3 she had set for years. It had been so long since she'd cooked for her children that she caught herself wondering what they ate now. Lucas probably ordered takeout between meetings, something in a paper bowl with a plastic fork. Anna, she imagined, drank more coffee than meals, surviving on art, heartbreak, and caffeine. She smiled at the thought, then stopped, realizing how long she'd been smiling at ghosts. By late morning, the sound of a car broke the stillness. Evelyn looked out the window and saw the familiar figure step out, Anna, her hair shorter now, her coat wrinkled, her face half hidden beneath fatigue. Evelyn hurried to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Anna, she said softly. Hi, Mom. For a moment, neither moved. Then Anna stepped forward and the years between them seemed to melt. Evelyn wrapped her arms around her daughter, breathing in the smell of paint, city dust, and something like sadness. You look thin, Evelyn said, her voice trembling with tenderness disguised as disapproval. Anna smiled faintly. You look exactly the same. They stood in the doorway a little too long, each waiting for the other to let go. When they finally moved inside, the warmth of the kitchen wrapped around them. You cooked, Anna said, surprised. I always cook, Evelyn replied. You just haven't been here to see it. Anna lowered her eyes. Yeah, sorry. Evelyn shook her head. You don't have to be sorry. You're here, that's enough. But it wasn't enough, not really. Both of them felt it, the way love and resentment can sit side by side at the same table, refusing to speak first. They ate quietly for a while, spooning stew and pretending it was just another Sunday. So, Evelyn said finally, how's the painting going? Anna shrugged. Complicated. That's an answer or an excuse? Anna gave a small, tired laugh. Both, maybe. I had a show last month. It didn't go great. Critics called it raw but unresolved, which I guess is a polite way to say they hated it. Evelyn reached across the table, covering her daughter's hand. They don't know what they're talking about. Anna smiled weakly. You haven't even seen the paintings. I don't have to, I know you. Anna looked away, swallowing emotion she didn't want to feel. I wish that were true, Mom. The words hung between them, sharp as broken glass. Evelyn didn't answer right away. I tried to understand you, she said quietly. I still do. Anna sighed. You tried to make me like you, that's not the same thing. Silence fell again, deep, uncomfortable, filled with everything they'd never said. Evelyn wanted to reach out, but years of walking on eggshells around her daughter had made her cautious. Just then the doorbell rang. Evelyn looked up, startled. Who could that be? Anna raised an eyebrow. You expecting someone? No. Evelyn walked to the door and opened it, and there stood Lucas, rein still in his hair, suitcase in hand. Surprise, he said. For a second she just stared. Luke, she gasped, her hand flying to her chest. You came? He smiled, awkward and unsure. Yeah, thought maybe I'd better. Anna appeared in the doorway behind her mother, her expression wary. Wow, look who decided to remember we exist. Lucas exhaled. Nice to see you too, Anna. Evelyn glanced between them. Now, both of you, let's just. She trailed off, her voice trembling with effort. Let's just sit down. They did 3 Moores at one table, a miracle wrapped in tension. Dinner was an exercise in pretending. Evelyn asked about work. Lucas answered in clipped sentences. Anna sipped her wine and rolled her eyes when he mentioned investors. They were grown now, but somehow every conversation still circled back to childhood, who was favored, who was blamed, who was misunderstood. At one point, Lucas leaned back and looked around. You really shouldn't be living here, Mom. I told you. Anna interrupted sharply. Can you stop? She loves this house. I'm just saying it's not safe. It's home, Anna snapped. That's what you don't get. Oh, please, Lucas said. You ran away from home the first chance you got. And you ran away emotionally, Anna shot back. Don't act superior because you did it with a job title. Enough. Evelyn's voice cracked through the room like thunder. Both of them froze. She was standing now, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You think I don't know you're angry? You think I don't know how much I failed you both? Her voice softened, breaking. I tried, every day I tried. Maybe I did it wrong. Maybe I held on too tight, but I gave you everything I had. Anna looked down, Lucas's jaw tightened, neither spoke. The silence that followed was heavy but different, the kind that humbles instead of divides. Evelyn sat down slowly, her hands trembling. Eat, she whispered. Please, just eat. And they did. For the first time in years, they ate together, not happily, not perfectly, but together. As the meal went on, something shifted, almost imperceptibly. Anna reached for the bread and passed it to her brother without being asked. Lucas poured water into her glass. They didn't look at each other, but the gesture was there, small, tentative, human. Evelyn noticed every second of it. When the plates were cleared, she gathered them up and walked to the sink. Her hands shook as she rinsed the dishes, her reflection wavering in the dark window. Behind her, the murmur of her children's voices filled the kitchen, soft, careful, almost gentle. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something like the beginning of forgiveness. And for a woman who had spent years talking to silence, that was more than enough. That night after they'd gone to bed, Anna in her old room, Lucas on the couch, Evelyn returned to the dining room. She looked at the table, still faintly warm from dinner, and smiled. 3 plates, 3 chairs, and for once none of them empty. She whispered into the quiet, Thank you, Richard, just for tonight they're home. The house didn't answer, it didn't have to. It was already breathing again. Morning came with the soft gold of forgiveness. The kind of light that slips between curtains and makes everything look possible again, even the things that aren't. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window, holding a cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink, watching as the steam rose and disappeared into the air, a vanishing act she knew too well. The night before had been something. Not perfect, not peaceful, but alive. For the first time in years, the house had voices again, laughter mixed with old arguments, sarcasm tangled with affection. It was messy. Human, real. She could still hear Anna humming faintly upstairs, the sound drifting like a shy bird testing its wings. Lucas had already gone for a run, leaving his sneakers by the door. That was him, restless, always in motion, as if stillness meant failure. Evelyn smiled softly, then sighed. Some habits don't belong to time, they belong to the soul. She turned back to the kitchen table, the battlefield turned sacred ground, and noticed the smallest thing. One of the plates from last night had cracked, a thin line running through it like lightning caught in porcelain. She traced it gently with her fingertip. A crack doesn't mean broken, she thought, it just means life passed through. By mid-morning, Daniel appeared at her porch, holding a toolbox and that familiar patient smile. Morning, Miss Moore, he said. Heard the rain last week did a number on your porch railing. I was hoping you didn't notice, she replied, laughing. Oh, I notice everything in this street, he said, eyes kind. Mind if I fix it? She hesitated. You really don't have to. I know I don't, that's why I'm offering. And with that, he set to work. The sound of hammering filled the air, rhythmic, comforting, like a heartbeat the house had been missing. Evelyn stood on the steps with a glass of lemonade, pretending to supervise, but mostly just grateful for the company. After a while, Daniel looked up and said, I saw both your kids' cars outside. That must feel good. It does, she said. It feels strange too, like they're guests in their own lives. He nodded. That's what happens. They grow up, but they forget to grow back toward you. She looked at him, touched by the simplicity of his truth. You sound like you've known that feeling. Every day, he said quietly. It's been 9 years since my boys visited. I still keep their room the same. Guess that's what we parents do, keep spaces ready, even when no one promises to return. Something inside her softened. She reached out and touched his arm gently. I'm sorry. He smiled. Don't be, regret's a heavy meal, best not to serve it too often. They shared a small, quiet laugh, and for the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt something she hadn't dared to feel. Warmth that wasn't motherly, companionship that didn't demand or owe. Inside, Anna had been listening. From her window, she saw her mother laughing with Daniel, laughing in a way she hadn't seen since her father died. It startled her, and if she was honest, it stung. By the time Evelyn came back inside, Anna was sitting at the table sketching, her pencil moving fast, sharp. Something beautiful? Evelyn asked, setting the lemonade glass down. Something real, Anna replied without looking up. Evelyn smiled softly. Well, that's the same thing, isn't it? Not always. The tone caught Evelyn off guard, not cruel, but cold enough to draw distance. Anna kept drawing, her lines fierce. Finally, she said, I saw you with Daniel. Oh, Evelyn said carefully. He was just fixing the porch. Yeah, I saw that too. There was a pause, heavy and unspoken. You like him, don't you? Evelyn blinked. Anna? It's okay, Anna said quickly. I mean, you're allowed to. I didn't think you would. Evelyn sat down across from her. Anna, your father's been gone a long time. I know that, Anna snapped, then softened. It's just I never thought you'd let someone else in. Evelyn looked down, folding her hands. I haven't, not really. Daniel's just he's kind, that's all. Anna's voice dropped. And what about Dad? What about him? Evelyn asked gently. Doesn't it feel like letting him go? The question pierced through her, quiet but devastating. Evelyn took a deep breath. I'll never let him go. Loving someone new doesn't erase what came before, Anna. It just means I'm still alive. Anna looked at her mother then, really looked, and for the first time she saw the woman not as a parent, but as a person. A tired, lonely person still brave enough to want. It unsettled her. I'm sorry, Anna whispered. For what? For making everything about me. Evelyn reached across the table and brushed her daughter's hair behind her ear. You're my everything. That's what mothers do. We make it about you. Later that afternoon, Lucas returned from his run, sweat-soaked and frowning at the sight of Daniel's toolbox by the porch. Who's been here? He asked. Daniel Reed, Evelyn said. He fixed the railing. Again, Lucas's tone sharpened. Mom, you shouldn't let random men hang around the house. Lucas, he's our neighbor. That doesn't mean anything. People take advantage. Lucas, she interrupted, her patience thinning. Daniel is a good man. You'd know that if you talked to him instead of assuming the worst. Anna, from the kitchen doorway, folded her arms. Oh, so you do care who she spends time with? Lucas turned. Don't start. Why not? You spend 5 minutes here and start giving orders like you own the place. At least I'm trying to protect her. From what? Anna shot back. Happiness? Enough. Evelyn shouted. The sharpness in her voice stunned them both. You two fight like the world owes you something. It doesn't. I'm the one who stayed. I'm the one who kept this roof standing. You don't get to come home and tell me who I can or can't let into my life. The silence afterward was thick and trembling. Lucas stared at her, guilt flickering across his face. I'm sorry, he muttered. Anna looked away. Evelyn turned toward the window, her back to them. You think I want pity? I don't. I just want peace, for once. In this house, I want peace. No one spoke after that. The only sound was the faint creak of the house, old wood remembering arguments past. That night, the house felt colder. Lucas retreated to the couch, staring at his phone as if it might rescue him. Anna stayed in her room, sketching shadows. Evelyn lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the clock tick. She thought about Richard, about the promise she'd made, about the cracks in her family, thin, spreading, inevitable. She turned toward the wall, running her fingers along a small fracture in the paint, one she'd meant to fix for years. Her thumb rested there, feeling the rough edge, the imperfection that time had carved. Maybe families were like walls, she thought, strong until silence got between the layers, and yet even with cracks they still stood. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, whispering through the dark. Inside, Evelyn closed her eyes and whispered back as if the house could hear her. Hold us together just a little longer. There are words we mean to say but never do because the moment doesn't feel right, or because silence seems safer than truth. Evelyn had learned to live with such unsentences, folded neatly between chores and memories, like the letters she kept in the bottom drawer of her dresser. That Sunday morning was quieter than most. The argument from the night before had left its echo in the walls, invisible but heavy. Lucas avoided everyone, pretending to scroll through his phone while drinking coffee that had long gone cold. Anna stayed upstairs, her door half shut, the sound of her pencil scratching faintly against paper, a truce built on distance. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, making breakfast no one asked for. Pancakes, bacon, sliced fruit, the smells of peace negotiations that never reached the table. She placed 3 plates down, then paused. 2 remained untouched. She sat, the spatula still in her hand, and thought about how often she'd tried to fix her family with food, with care, with patience, as if love could be measured in servings. That's when she decided to write, not a note, not a text, but letters, one for each of them. Words that had waited too long to be said. She went upstairs to her room, took out the wooden box from the dresser, and found a small stack of cream-colored stationery she'd saved for important things. She hadn't known what those things were until now. At the top of the first page, she wrote, "For Lucas." The pen hesitated before it moved, as if unsure it still had permission to speak. Then the words began to flow. "My dear boy, you were always running, even before you knew what from. Your father used to say you had lightning in your veins. I suppose he was right. I've watched you chase success like it was oxygen, and part of me is proud. But another part, the mother part, wishes you'd stop long enough to see how far you've already come. You don't have to fix everything, Luke. Not me, not the house, not the past. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is sit still long enough to listen. And if you ever wonder where home is, it's still here. It's always been here. Love, Mom." Her hand trembled slightly when she finished. She stared at the words, at the familiar loops and slants of her handwriting, and felt something loosen in her chest. Then she began the next one. "For Anna, my sweet girl. You have your father's eyes, not just their color, but the way they see the world as something to be understood, not owned. You've always carried your heart too close to the surface. That's a blessing and a burden, I know. I used to wish I could protect you from how deeply you felt everything. But if I had, you wouldn't be you. Art is the way you speak truth, even when words fail. Don't let disappointment make you quiet. And please, don't mistake my worry for doubt. I've always believed in you, I just didn't always know how to say it. Love, Mom." She folded both letters carefully, pressing the creases with the side of her hand. Then she slipped them into 2 envelopes, writing their names in her neat, looping script. She placed the envelopes on her nightstand, intending to give them later, when tempers had cooled, when timing felt right. But life has a way of deciding when later should come. That afternoon, Evelyn went to the backyard to hang laundry. The sky was pale blue, the kind of blue that made you feel small and hopeful all at once. She pegged shirts and sheets to the line, watching them flutter in the breeze like flags of surrender. Daniel came by, carrying a small basket of apples. "Peace offering," he said with a smile, "for surviving your children under one roof." She laughed softly. "Barely survived. They'll come around," he said. "Kids always do eventually. The trick is staying alive long enough to see it." "Is that your secret?" she asked. "Patience," he said, "and pie." They sat on the porch again, talking about nothing, the weather, the garden, how autumn seemed to come earlier each year. Evelyn found herself telling him about the letters, not what they said, only that she'd written them. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes writing's the only way to tell the truth," he said. "I used to write to my wife after she passed. Never mailed them, of course, but it helped, made her feel closer." Evelyn looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just a neighbor, but a man carrying his own kind of silence. "Maybe that's what we all do," she said softly. "Keep talking to ghosts." Later that evening, as the sun slipped behind the maples, Evelyn went inside to start dinner. The light through the kitchen window turned everything gold, like the world had forgiven itself. Anna wandered in, barefoot, holding her sketchbook. "Smells good," she said. "Thank you, darling." Evelyn smiled. "I thought we could eat early tonight, maybe together." Anna hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." They worked side by side, chopping, stirring, not talking much. But it was a gentler silence this time, the kind that says, "I'm trying." Halfway through setting the table, Anna went upstairs to grab her sweater. She passed her mother's bedroom and noticed the envelopes on the nightstand. Her name, Lucas's name. She hesitated, biting her lip, then reached out and picked one up for Anna. It was curiosity first, but when she unfolded the paper, curiosity dissolved into something else. The words hit her like a wave. By the time she reached the last line, "I've always believed in you, I just didn't always know how to say it," tears had blurred the ink. She pressed the letter to her chest, her breath shaky. For years, she had mistaken her mother's worry for judgment, her quietness for disappointment. Now, reading those words, she saw what had always been there: love, clumsy and desperate, but constant. When she came back downstairs, her eyes were red. Evelyn looked up from the stove. "You okay?" Anna nodded quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine," but her voice cracked on the last word. Evelyn turned off the burner. "Sweetheart." Anna crossed the kitchen and hugged her before she could finish. It was fierce and wordless, the kind of embrace that repairs things without asking how they broke. Evelyn held her daughter close, her heart beating against the weight of all the years they'd wasted misunderstanding each other. "I love you," she whispered into her hair. "I know," Anna murmured. "I just forgot for a while." Evelyn smiled through tears. "Me too." That night, when Evelyn went upstairs to check her letters, she found one envelope missing. The other, for Lucas, was still there, waiting. She didn't mind. Some messages, she thought, were meant to be found early. Outside, the wind had picked up again, brushing against the windows. She could hear Lucas downstairs, his low voice on the phone, talking about flights, deadlines, life. She wondered if he'd ever find his letter, if she'd ever have the courage to give it to him. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and whispered, "Not tonight." Then she placed it back on the nightstand, beside the lamp that glowed softly against the dark. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt the quiet of her house not as loneliness, but as peace. And in the room next door, Anna sat on her bed, rereading her mother's letter, a single tear marking the paper, a signature of understanding, years overdue. There's a certain stillness that comes before a storm, a strange pause where even the wind seems to hold its breath. That night, the air carried that silence, heavy and expectant, as if the world itself were waiting to speak. Evelyn felt it in her bones long before the sky broke. She always had. Years working night shifts at the hospital had trained her to sense changes in pressure, in weather, in people, in fate. By late evening, the house was dim except for the golden light spilling from the kitchen window. The rain hadn't started yet, but thunder whispered somewhere far off, a warning rumbling over the horizon. She was standing at the sink, rinsing dishes from dinner, a quiet meal shared with Anna and Lucas that had almost felt normal. There had been laughter, cautious but real, and for a brief moment, the house had sounded like it used to. Now, as she wiped her hands on a towel, she looked out the window and watched the trees sway against a restless sky. The first drop hit the glass, then another, then a dozen more until the world blurred into movement. "Storm's coming fast," Daniel's voice called from the porch. Evelyn opened the door to find him standing there, hat in hand, his hair damp from the drizzle. "I thought you'd already gone home," she said, surprised. "Was closing up my shed when I saw your porch light flicker," he replied. "Thought I'd check in before the power goes out. It's a rough one tonight." "You don't need to worry about me," she said, smiling softly. "I've lived through plenty of storms." "I know," he said, eyes kind, "but sometimes it's nice not to weather them alone." She hesitated, not because she didn't want company, but because accepting kindness had become a skill she'd nearly forgotten. "Come in then," she said finally. "At least until it passes." He stepped inside, shaking the rain from his jacket, and the house seemed to sigh with relief. Upstairs, Anna was sketching by candlelight, the steady scratch of pencil filling the room. Every so often, lightning flashed through the window, white and sharp, briefly illuminating her unfinished portrait, a woman's hands, open, holding a small house cradled like a heart. Downstairs, Lucas sat at the dining table with his laptop open, scrolling through work emails despite the flickering lights. "We might lose Wi-Fi," Evelyn warned as she poured him another cup of coffee. "Figures," he muttered, glancing at his screen. "Can't get away from deadlines, even during Armageddon." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the universe's way of telling you to take a break." He looked up, half amused. "You sound like Dad." The words hung there between them. It wasn't often that Lucas mentioned his father, not since the funeral, when grief had turned him into something brittle and unreachable. Evelyn swallowed hard. He used to say that? Yeah, Lucas said softly. Whenever the power went out, he'd say it was God's way of making us sit still. We'd light candles and play cards until you'd make hot chocolate. Evelyn's eyes softened. You remember that? Of course, he said, smiling faintly. You'd always let Anna win. She laughed. No, your sister cheated. From upstairs, Anna's voice called out, I heard that. They all laughed then, a small, fragile joy threading through the sound of thunder. By 10 o'clock, the rain had grown heavy, pounding against the roof like a drum beat. The power flickered twice, then died, leaving the house wrapped in darkness. Well, Daniel said, setting down the candle he'd been holding, looks like we've officially entered the pioneer era. Evelyn lit another candle and placed it near the window. At least it's peaceful, she said. No phones, no screens. Lucas groaned. No Wi-Fi. Exactly, she said with a smile. They sat together in the living room, Evelyn, Daniel, Lucas, and Anna, the candlelight soft and trembling, shadows moving like old ghosts on the walls. For a while, no one spoke. The storm did the talking, wind howling, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rumbling low like a sleeping giant. Then Evelyn stood suddenly. I need to check the basement, she said. The last time it rained this hard, the sump pump failed. I'll go, Daniel offered. No, I've got it. You wouldn't know where things are. Before anyone could argue, she had already grabbed a flashlight and disappeared down the stairs. The basement was damp and cold, the smell of concrete and time filling the air. Water had begun seeping through the foundation, pooling near the furnace. Evelyn cursed softly under her breath, kneeling to clear the drain. Her knees ached, her back protested, but she kept working. Above her, thunder cracked so loudly that dust rained from the ceiling. She looked up, and that's when the lights above her flickered violently, then went out completely. Damn it, she whispered, turning on her flashlight. The beam wavered, weak and pale. Mom, Lucas's voice shouted from upstairs. I'm fine, she called back. Just give me a minute. But she wasn't fine. The water was rising faster now, swirling around her ankles. She tried to stand, but her knee buckled. She reached for the railing, missed, and stumbled hard against the wall. Pain shot up her side, and the flashlight rolled away, its light spinning wildly before going out. For a moment, all she could hear was the storm and her own shallow breathing. Mom, Anna's voice now, closer, frantic. Evelyn started, but the word caught in her throat. Within seconds, Lucas was at the top of the basement stairs, his phone flashlight cutting through the dark. Mom, here, she called weakly. He splashed through the water, reaching her just as Daniel appeared behind him. Careful, Evelyn said, breath trembling. Floor's slick. You shouldn't be down here, Lucas said, kneeling beside her, his voice cracked. God, Mom, why didn't you call for help? Because I'm your mother, she said with a shaky laugh. Old habits die hard. Anna appeared at the top of the stairs, eyes wide with fear. Is she okay? She's fine, Daniel said firmly. We've got her. Between the three of them, they helped her upstairs, Lucas supporting one side, Daniel the other. Evelyn protested, of course, but they ignored her. When they reached the living room, they wrapped her in a blanket, and Anna knelt beside her, holding her hand tightly. Mom, Anna whispered, tears glinting in her eyes, you scared us. Evelyn looked at her children, grown, frightened, and suddenly small again, and smiled softly. It's all right, I'm okay. But Lucas's voice broke when he said, You're not allowed to say that anymore. She frowned. What do you mean? He swallowed hard. You're not allowed to be the strong one all the time. Not anymore. Let us help you for once. The rain hammered harder as if to underline his words. For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing. Then she nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. All right, she whispered. You can help. Anna leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, and Lucas took her other hand. Daniel sat quietly nearby, the candlelight catching the lines in his face, a man grateful simply to be needed. Outside, the storm raged on, fierce and unrelenting. But inside, something gentler began to settle, a fragile peace, a silent promise. Evelyn looked at her children, their faces flickering in the candlelight, and realized something profound. Storms didn't just destroy. Sometimes they stripped everything down to what truly mattered. And in that moment, soaked, shivering, surrounded by love she'd almost forgotten how to receive, Evelyn Moore felt, for the first time in years, that she was home. Morning came like an apology, soft, gray, and quiet, as if the world itself regretted the violence of the night before. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining. The trees bowed low under the weight of water. Inside the butter-colored house, everything smelled faintly of damp wood and candle wax. The living room was still scattered with blankets, flashlights, and half-melted candles, the relics of a night none of them would soon forget. Evelyn woke slowly, her body stiff. Her head heavy, she was on the couch, tucked beneath a quilt she didn't remember pulling over herself. The soft murmur of voices drifted from the kitchen, Anna and Lucas speaking in low tones. She closed her eyes again, listening. Her blood pressure was low last night, Lucas was saying. We should call Dr. Patel just to be safe. I already did, Anna replied. He's coming this afternoon, she'll hate that. I don't care if she hates it, Lucas said. She scared the hell out of us. There was a pause, then Anna said quietly, You were really worried. Of course I was, she's mom. Evelyn smiled faintly, her chest tightening with something both warm and painful. She wanted to sit up and tell them she was fine, but for once she didn't. It was oddly comforting to hear them whisper about her like that, not out of anger, but care. By the time she sat up, Daniel was already at the door, holding 2 cups of coffee. You've got a full house, he said softly. Evelyn smiled weakly. It's nice, isn't it? Feels right, he said, handing her the cup. You scared us all last night. I'm tougher than I look, she said, taking a sip. Maybe, he said, smiling. But even oak trees fall when they're tired enough. She looked at him then, really looked. There was something unspoken in his eyes, a tenderness that made her heart ache. You didn't have to stay. I know, he said simply, but I wanted to. She opened her mouth to reply, but Lucas entered the room before she could. Morning, Mom, how are you feeling? Like someone ran me over with a memory, she said, wincing as she shifted her legs. Anna followed him in, carrying a tray with toast and orange juice. You're not moving off that couch until the doctor comes. Evelyn chuckled. Listen to you two, bossing me around in my own house. Lucas smiled. Guess it's our turn. The three of them sat together, awkward at first, then easier, the way people rediscover rhythm after forgetting the steps. The conversation moved between concern and laughter, and for once there was no edge to it, only the soft hum of family trying again. Dr. Patel arrived that afternoon, a kind man with silver hair and eyes that always seemed to smile before his mouth did. He checked Evelyn's vitals, asked her to breathe deep, and frowned gently. Your blood pressure's low, he said, and you're running on fumes, Evelyn. Stress like this doesn't just fade. You need rest, real rest, not the kind where you still worry in your sleep. I'll rest, she said quickly. Promise? She hesitated, then nodded. Promise. But the look he gave her said he didn't quite believe her. After he left, Anna sat beside her on the couch, folding her knees up under herself like she used to as a child. Mom, she said softly, you scared me last night. I scared myself, Evelyn admitted. I thought for a second I wouldn't make it up those stairs. Anna's eyes glistened. Don't say that. I have to, Evelyn said gently. We can't keep pretending time owes us something. She reached for her daughter's hand, her voice trembling. Listen to me, sweetheart. If something ever happens to me, I need you and your brother to stay close. Don't let pride get between you again. Promise me. Anna squeezed her hand hard. Don't talk like that. You're fine. Promise me, Evelyn repeated. Anna nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I promise. Evelyn smiled weakly. Good girl. Lucas came in a few minutes later, his laptop under one arm. Doctor says you need rest. I'll stay another few days just in case. Evelyn blinked in surprise. You will? Yeah, he said. Work can wait. She laughed softly. Now I know I must be dying. Lucas smiled. Not funny. He sat beside her, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor for a long moment. Then, without looking up, he said, Mom, I'm sorry. For what? For being so far, for treating you like a problem I could solve later. She reached over, touched his face, and whispered, You came home, that's all that matters. He covered her hand with his own. I should have come sooner. Life's messy, she said softly. We forgive or we drown. Daniel stood quietly in the doorway, watching them, mother and son, hands clasped in fragile reconciliation. When Evelyn's eyes met his, he nodded once as if to say, See? They're finding their way back. That evening, the storm clouds cleared completely, leaving behind a bruised but beautiful sunset. The air smelled of wet leaves and clean beginnings. Evelyn sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Daniel joined her, sitting close enough for warmth but not too close for comfort. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked suddenly. He glanced at her. "For you or for all of us?" "Both. All the time," he said, "but I try not to plan too far ahead. Life seems to prefer surprises." She smiled faintly. "You're not wrong." They sat in silence, watching the last light slip through the trees. A family of cardinals darted through the branches, their wings like small fires against the gray. Finally, she said, "I made my children promise something today." "What's that?" "They'd stay close after I'm gone." Daniel looked at her startled. "You're not going anywhere, Evelyn?" "Maybe not yet," she said, "but one day, and I want to leave knowing they have each other." He was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You've done that already. Whether you see it or not, you brought them back." She looked at him then, her eyes glassy with tears. "I didn't bring them back. The storm did." He reached for her hand and held it gently, steadily. "Then maybe storms aren't as bad as we think." Evelyn laughed quietly, the sound caught somewhere between gratitude and exhaustion. "You always find a way to make sense of things." "Maybe that's my job," he said, "keeping you from giving up on happy endings." She leaned back in her chair, watching the sky turn from orange to blue to almost night. "I'm not giving up," she said. "I'm just learning how to let go a little at a time." Daniel looked at her, her silver hair haloed by the fading light, her eyes still fierce despite their softness, and thought she had never looked more alive. Inside, Lucas and Anna were cleaning up together, moving in easy rhythm, talking quietly. For once, no sharp words passed between them. Evelyn smiled faintly at the sound, her heart filling with something close to peace. She whispered, half to herself, half to the night, "If I leave tomorrow, I'll go knowing they're all right." And Daniel, still holding her hand, whispered back, "Then that's the best kind of goodbye." The porch light hummed softly above them. The air was cool, the world finally calm, and somewhere deep inside that small, butter-colored house, a promise settled, unspoken but understood. Love, once given, doesn't fade. It just changes form. The morning Evelyn Moore didn't wake up was the kind of morning she had always loved: soft sunlight pressing gently through the curtains, birds calling from the maple trees, the house breathing in its quiet way. It was peaceful. So peaceful that when Anna came downstairs, she thought her mother was simply napping on the porch again, wrapped in her favorite blue blanket. "Mom," she said lightly, setting down her mug of coffee. No answer. The teacup beside Evelyn's chair was half full, the steam long gone. A book rested open on her lap, The Old Man and the Sea, a bookmark tucked neatly at page 93. Her glasses still perched on her nose. "Mom," Anna repeated, softer now, stepping closer. It wasn't until she touched her mother's shoulder that she realized. The warmth was gone. The world tilted. A sound rose in her throat, not quite a scream, not quite a word, and then the silence fell heavy, like a curtain closing. Lucas was in the kitchen when he heard her cry. He ran outside, barefoot, heart hammering in his chest, the screen door slamming behind him. For a moment, time became viscous, the kind of slow panic where the world moves and you don't. He saw Anna kneeling beside their mother's chair, her face buried against Evelyn's arm. Daniel stood nearby, his expression caught between disbelief and sorrow, a hand trembling near his mouth. "Anna," Lucas whispered, though he already knew. She looked up, her eyes red, her voice small. "She's gone." He froze, then slowly he knelt down beside her, one hand clutching the armrest of the chair, the other reaching for the hand that had once held his through scraped knees, through nightmares, through every failure he had ever come home to hide. It was still and soft like folded linen. "Mom," he whispered as if she might hear. "We're here, we're all here." But the house said nothing. Only the wind replied, brushing through the porch, carrying the faint scent of her lavender soap. The hours after that blurred. Paramedics came, gentle and professional, their voices quiet as rain. A doctor confirmed what everyone already knew. There was no suffering, he said kindly. No pain, just sleep. Lucas called the neighbors. Anna called the pastor. Daniel handled everything else: the paperwork, the questions, the things that needed doing when grief leaves you unable to move. By afternoon, the house was full of people who spoke in whispers, casseroles arriving in covered dishes, condolences stacked beside coffee cups. But Evelyn's absence was louder than any sound. In the midst of it all, Anna found herself back in her mother's room. The air still smelled of rosewater and clean linen. The bed was neatly made, her nightgown folded on the chair. On the nightstand sat the lamp, the reading glasses, and a single envelope, her brother's name written on it in their mother's careful script. For Lucas, Anna's breath caught. She picked it up slowly, fingers trembling. Lucas, she called softly. He appeared in the doorway, his face pale and exhausted. What is it? She left this for you. He took the envelope, staring at it as though afraid it might vanish. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The paper inside was creased and faintly scented of lavender. He read silently at first, then aloud, his voice breaking on the words. My dear boy, if you're reading this, I'm somewhere quieter now. Don't be angry, not at time, not at yourself. You gave me more than you'll ever know. Every call, every visit, even the ones that never came, I carried them all with me. Please don't try to fix what's gone. You can't rebuild the past, Luke. You can only carry it forward. Take care of your sister. She'll need you in ways she won't admit. And when you feel lost, go home, not the house, the feeling. You'll find it inside you. Love always, Mom. When he finished, silence settled again. Anna was crying softly now, her hand pressed against her mouth. Lucas folded the letter carefully, holding it against his chest. She knew, he whispered. She knew we'd need her even after she was gone. Anna nodded, her tears falling freely. She always did. That evening, the three of them, Lucas, Anna, and Daniel, sat together on the porch as the sun went down. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that feels borrowed from memory. She wanted to be cremated, Daniel said quietly. Her will's simple, she even picked the spot under the maple tree out back. Anna smiled faintly through tears. Of course she did, she loved that tree. Lucas nodded. Dad planted it the year I was born. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade behind the leaves. Somewhere down the street, wind chimes rang, Daniel's, singing softly in the distance. After a long pause, Anna said, I found her notebook. Lucas looked up. What notebook? The one she used for lists and recipes. It's full of things she wanted to remember and a few things she wanted us to remember. She opened it, reading aloud. Don't let the house go to strangers. Keep the garden alive, especially the tomatoes. Invite laughter even when it's inconvenient. Remember, forgiveness is the only inheritance that doesn't run out. Her voice cracked on the last line. She closed the book gently, as if afraid to disturb the words. Lucas swallowed hard. She really thought of everything. She always did, Anna whispered. Daniel looked at the two of them, then at the quiet porch that had held so much life and love and loss. She left you both more than a house, he said softly. She left you a way to keep going. Later, after the guests had gone and the stars had come out, Anna stood by the window of her old room. Outside, the maple tree swayed in the evening breeze. She could almost see her mother there, kneeling in the dirt, humming softly, hands deep in the soil, planting something that would outlive her. She whispered, I'll keep the garden, Mom, I promise. Downstairs, Lucas sat at the kitchen table, the letter beside him, a cup of untouched tea cooling in front of him. He looked around the room, the same walls, the same table, the same quiet that had once annoyed him. But now, it felt different. It felt sacred. He picked up his phone, scrolled to Anna's name, and texted, You still awake? Yeah, let's start fixing the roof tomorrow. The house stays. There was a pause, then her reply appeared. Okay, the house stays. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the faintest trace of lavender. The porch light, the one Evelyn had always promised to keep on, still glowed against the dark. And though she was gone, the house did not feel empty. It felt full of her voice, her laughter, her love. Because love, as Evelyn had always believed, doesn't vanish with time or death. It lingers in letters left behind, in recipes remembered, in gardens kept alive. And under the maple tree that night, the world itself seemed to whisper her final truth. Home isn't a place you live in. It's the people who remember you enough to stay. Grief has a way of changing its shape. At first, it's sharp and relentless, the kind that keeps you awake, that makes the air feel heavier, that fills the house with too much quiet. But over time, it softens. It becomes something you carry, like a photograph in your pocket, always there but no longer crushing. It had been 6 months since Evelyn Moore's passing, and the butter-colored house had learned how to live without her, though, in truth, she was everywhere. The kitchen still smelled faintly of rosemary and soap. The porch still held the soft dent of her favorite chair. The wind chime Daniel had fixed for her still sang whenever the breeze came through. And in the evenings, when the light spilled through the windows just right, it seemed to paint her silhouette on the walls, as if she was still moving quietly through her home, tending, listening, loving. Lucas had stayed. He'd taken an indefinite leave from his job in San Francisco, trading late-night boardrooms for long afternoons with hammers and paintbrushes. The house had needed work, new gutters, repaired shutters, the porch steps sanded down, and he found a strange comfort in fixing what could be fixed. Each nail he drove, each board he replaced felt like an apology. Anna had moved back too, at least for a while. Her small apartment in the city had become too loud, too empty. Here, surrounded by the hum of her childhood, she painted again, slowly, honestly. She turned the old dining room into a studio, the table covered with brushes and half-finished canvases. Some days her art was about light, other days about absence. But all of it, in some way, was about their mother. Daniel came by most mornings with coffee and the quiet steadiness of someone who understood that love didn't end, it just changed its form. He helped Lucas rebuild the garden fence and fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen. Sometimes he stayed for lunch. Sometimes he just sat on the porch, saying little, as if the silence between them all was enough. The three of them, Lucas, Anna, Daniel, had fallen into an unspoken rhythm. They didn't talk about grief much anymore, they just worked. And in the working, they healed. It was Anna's idea to open the house to the community. She'd like it, she said one morning, her hair tied back, paint smudged on her cheek. She always wanted this place to be full of people. Remember how she'd keep the door open in summer? Anyone could walk in and she'd feed them? Lucas smiled. Yeah, she used to say a full table was proof of a good life. Exactly, Anna said. So let's make it that again, not just for us, for everyone. And so they did. They called it the Quiet House Project, a small community space where anyone could come to read, paint, garden, or simply sit. The front room became a reading nook, filled with donated books and one old armchair that had belonged to Evelyn. The kitchen was turned into a shared space for cooking classes and neighborhood dinners. The backyard, her beloved garden, became a sanctuary, full of tomatoes, herbs, and laughter. On opening day, people from all over the town came. Some brought flowers, others brought memories. One woman from the church said, Evelyn once visited me every day when my husband was sick. She barely knew me then. Another neighbor added, she gave my boy his first job mowing her lawn, paid him more than he deserved. Every story was small, but together they painted a portrait more vivid than any photograph could capture. Anna hung one of her new paintings in the living room, a soft, glowing image of their mother standing under the maple tree, looking skyward, her face half in shadow, half in light. Beneath it, she wrote in small, neat letters, "Love never leaves." When she stepped back, she saw Lucas standing behind her. His eyes were wet. She'd be proud, he said. Anna smiled, tears catching in her throat. No, she'd probably tell me to fix the brushwork. He laughed, and in that laugh was everything they had lost and found again. That night, after the last guests had gone, the house was quiet again, but not empty. The lights from the garden cast a soft glow through the windows. Lucas sat on the porch with Daniel, sipping coffee, the air warm and still. She did it, you know, Daniel said after a while. Did what? Found a way to stay. Lucas nodded slowly. Yeah, she always said love doesn't disappear, it just changes address. Daniel chuckled. That sounds like her. Inside, Anna was tidying up the table when she noticed something. Beneath a stack of donated books was a small notebook she didn't recognize, leather-bound, the corners worn. She opened it carefully. It was her mother's handwriting. The first page read, "If you're reading this, I hope the house is still standing and the light still works in the kitchen. I hope the garden is green and someone still hums while washing dishes. Mostly, I hope you both found your way back, not just to this house, but to each other." Anna sat down slowly, her hand pressed against her heart. When she told Lucas and Daniel later, none of them spoke for a long time. They just sat together on the porch, the notebook open between them, the words glowing softly in the lamplight. Weeks passed. Summer bled into autumn. The trees turned gold, and the evenings grew shorter. Every night before locking up the quiet house, Anna would walk to the porch light, the same one her mother had always kept on, and switch it on. For her, Lucas asked once, For anyone who's lost their way, she replied. You never know who might need it. And sometimes, as they sat under the maple tree, the one that shaded Evelyn's ashes, they could almost hear her voice in the rustling leaves. Not words, not exactly, but something close. A kind of knowing. Home had changed, yes. But it was still here, breathing, alive, filled with the echo of a mother's love that refused to fade. And as the wind moved through the branches and the porch light glowed against the dark, the Moore family understood something Evelyn had always known but never said aloud. You don't have to stay for love to last. You just have to leave enough of it behind for others to find their way home. Autumn settled gently over Maple Street. The air turned crisp, and the leaves fell like slow confetti, carpeting the ground in shades of gold and rust. The butter-colored house, once lonely, once silent, now stood warm and alive, its windows glowing each night like lanterns guiding wanderers home. Inside, life had found its rhythm again. Anna painted in the mornings, often with sunlight spilling across her canvas. Her art had changed, less turmoil, more tenderness. She painted children reading in the garden, neighbors laughing over coffee, and her mother's hands, always her hands, folding, planting, creating. Lucas spent most of his time outdoors, tending to the yard with the same precision he once gave to coding. The garden flourished under his care, rows of tomatoes, basil, and rosemary stretching toward the light. You've got her touch, Anna teased once, watching him work. He only smiled and said, maybe she left it here. And Daniel, quiet, steadfast Daniel, still came by every morning, bringing 2 cups of coffee. One for Lucas, one for Anna, and a third he always placed by Evelyn's chair on the porch rail. He'd let it sit there until it cooled, then pour it gently into the soil beneath the maple tree. For the roots, he said, she'd like that. The quiet house had become more than they ever imagined. Children came after school to read, older neighbors came to talk, and people who had once walked by with their heads down now lingered, drawn by the sound of music or laughter drifting from the open windows. Every visitor seemed to bring a new story about Evelyn Moore, how she'd driven them to the clinic once, how she'd left soup on their doorstep during a hard winter, how she'd listened, really listened, when no one else had time. Her presence had become the town's invisible thread, weaving through everyone she'd ever touched. One Sunday evening, as the sun melted into amber light, Anna found Lucas sitting on the porch steps, gazing at the maple tree. The wind moved gently through its branches, scattering leaves that glowed like embers. She'd love this, Anna said softly, sitting beside him. Yeah, Lucas replied, she would. For a while, they just watched the light fade. Then Anna said, you know what I realized? She never really asked for much. Not money, not success, just for us to stay close. Lucas nodded, and keep the light on. They both turned to the porch lamp, its steady glow warming the gathering dusk. The bulb had burned out once since she passed, but Lucas had replaced it that same night. He'd done it without thinking, as naturally as breathing. She said once that a light is like a promise, Anna said. Lucas smiled faintly. Then we'll keep it burning. As the seasons turned again, the house changed hands in small ways, new paint, new flowers, new laughter, but its soul never did. The community grew around it. The garden became a place where children learned to plant seeds and wait patiently for something beautiful to grow. Anna's art began to sell. She donated every dollar to keeping the quiet house running, new books, free meals, more chairs for the reading porch. Each year on Evelyn's birthday, they held a gathering under the maple tree. Neighbors brought candles, stories, and songs. Some years it rained, but they came anyway. And without fail, Daniel would say, smiling through tears, Evelyn would tell us not to fuss, and then she'd make pie for everyone. They would all laugh, the kind of laughter that hurts a little because it remembers. Years later, when time had softened the sharp edges of loss, the quiet house became a landmark, not for its architecture, but for what it meant. Travelers passing through the town often stopped to rest there, drawn by the sign outside that read, "The Quiet House, a place where love stays." Inside, Anna's favorite painting still hung on the wall, Evelyn beneath the maple tree, her eyes turned skyward, her hands open. Beneath it, in Lucas's careful handwriting, was a small brass plaque that read, "Love never leaves, it just finds a new home." And every evening, as dusk fell, the porch light glowed softly, steady, unwavering, eternal. Some say that if you stand outside the fence on quiet nights, you can hear the faint hum of her voice in the wind, humming the same lullaby she once sang to her children. Whether it's memory, wind, or something beyond, no one can say. But the light never goes out, because promises like hers don't end. They stay. Author's note. Thank you for walking this journey with Evelyn, with Lucas, with Anna, with Daniel, and with the small butter-colored house that became a home again. This story is a reminder that love, in its truest, quietest form, never disappears. It lingers in laughter, in memory, in every kind thing we leave behind. To every reader who has loved, lost, and loved again, may you always find your way home. May your table stay full, and may your light, like Evelyn's, never go out. With gratitude and heart, wishing you health, peace, and a family that holds you close. The author.